Hello again, everyone. Mike Goucher from Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center with you today. And this is On the Issues. And today we are presenting the latest Marquette University Law School poll. Joining us today, as he always does for the poll release, is Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the poll. And Charles, we were in the field at a very interesting moment in American history, right after the debate, but also in the midst of the news stories about President Trump and his positive test for COVID. So I thought it'd be wise to begin there. When precisely were we in the field for this survey?
Right. We were in the field September 30th to October 4th. So that was starting the day after the debate. So everything we did is post-debate. But then President Trump announced his positive test after we had finished polling on the second night. So then Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of our poll period are all post-diagnosis. And so we've asked a few questions of those people that we got after the diagnosis. We added some questions in light of that. But everything's post-debate, and 450 before the diagnosis, 355 cases after the diagnosis.
So how many likely voters in this sample, Charles?
In this sample, there are 700 likely voters. That's a margin of error of plus or minus 4.6. 805 total registered voters, 4.2 margin of error. And in this subset that we interviewed after the diagnosis, it's 355 with a margin of error of 6.4.
And a quick question about the composition of the sample. People are always eager to know how many Democrats, how many Republicans. What do we have this time?
In this one, it's 44% Republican, 45 Democratic, and 10% independent. 45-45 is the long-term split. And if you don't include people that lean to a party, it's dead even, 29 Republican, 29 Democrat, and 41 independent. Again, close to the normal margin. Usually we're at 30 Republican, 29 Dem.
So again, as we pointed out, Charles, this survey was done after the presidential debate. So I guess let's begin with how the presidential contest looks right now. Again, debate was done. This is our first poll since that debate. What did we find?
Well, once again, we've seen all kinds of events take place this year, and so many events just in this week that we were in the field, but not very much changed. We have Biden at 46%, Trump at 41%, Jorgensen, the Libertarian, at 4%, and 8% saying they're undecided, might vote for still someone else. That's, again, with likely voters. That gives Biden a 5-point margin in this poll. It was 4 points in September. And so very little change, certainly inside the margin of error change.
Charles, remarkably consistent polling in this election cycle as opposed to 2016 or 2012. We saw a little more bouncing around in those polls.
We certainly did. In both 12 and 16, we saw surges for each candidate. A substantial surge for Romney, for example, after the first debate in 2012. And in 2016, we had a very close race early, 3-point Clinton margin that rose to a 6-point margin at the end. And of course, we got that wrong. But we had also seen even bigger margins over the summer in 2016. This year, it's the polar opposite from both of those years. If you go back to May, our Biden has led in all of them, but by 4 points, 6 points, 5 points, 4 points, and now 5 points again. So there's just no trend from May till the present. And that's really been pretty much true since August of 2019. We've had a few more ups and downs over that longer haul. But really, once we've switched to likely voters this summer, we've seen very little change. And for that matter, if we looked at registered voters, they're not moving very much over the summer either. This is just a function of people being very, very dug in on their choices.
So of the people we interviewed, Charles, after the president announced that he had tested positive for the coronavirus, How seriously did people think how serious did they think the president's illness was?
Yeah, and recognizing that this is, of course, something that was going on at the time. So our Friday night interviews, he had just gone to the hospital, and then Saturday and Sunday he was still in the hospital. We finished interviewing before he went back to the White House on Monday. So understand that this is something that's in process. But a third, 33%, think that he has a mild case of COVID. 13% think it's a moderate case, 8% serious, and 3% say a very serious case. But perhaps sensibly, fully 37% say they're not sure at this point how serious his case is.
Let's talk for a moment about a couple of other questions that we asked and added to as we were in the field. One of them is about whether or not the candidates should be holding in-person rallies. Should they continue to do that, or should they not do that? Is that not safe?
Yes, and this again is after the president's diagnosis was announced. 52% said that both campaigns should stop holding in-person rallies, but 37% thought it was safe and those rallies should continue.
We have debates coming up. There's a vice presidential debate tonight, and then we, of course, have two more presidential debates scheduled. Did voters think the debate should continue despite what had happened to the president?
Yeah, this is the opposite of the way people went on the rallies. 67% said the rallies or the debate should go forward. Just 23% thought that they should be canceled. Now, we did ask first off about the upcoming vice presidential debate, which is this week. And so people might be influenced in part by thinking of the vice presidential debate, which obviously doesn't involve the president.
There's a sort of a new focus on the vice presidential debate, I guess you could say, in light of what has happened to the president, also in light of the age of both of the presidential candidates. And I guess the question is, how confident are voters in both of the vice presidential nominees, Vice President Pence and Senator Harris?
Yes, and this is one we had not asked. We've been monitoring how people feel about both Pence and Harris, but we had not asked a question about their ability to assume the duties of the office. So in light of the president's illness, we added these again just to that set of people we interviewed after the illness was confirmed. 33% were very confident of Pence's ability to perform the duties of president. 23% somewhat confident, so that's 56 total there. 12% not very, and 21% not at all confident. For Kamala Harris, it's a little bit lower, 25% very confident, 20% somewhat, 11 not very, and 29 not at all. I think in part this is the difference between a sitting vice president who has had a good deal of experience as well as a U.S. senator who is still not as well known to the public as the vice president is.
Charles, who did people in the state of Wisconsin think did best in the presidential debate that was held last week?
Our results here mirror national results very clearly. And I should say, this is a question now that we're asked of the entire sample because everyone was talked about too after the debate. But by a 2-to-1 margin, people think Biden did best. And we phrased it as regardless of who you support, who do you think did best? 41% say Biden did best, 20% say Trump, but 14% say they both did badly, and 21% say they didn't pay much attention to the debate. And that 2-to-1 margin with a substantial percentage saying both did poorly is something we've seen in post-debate national polling as well. In this, we seem to mirror the country pretty well.
We also see our stark contrasts in how we view politics today reflected in how people thought that debate went.
Partisan differences are certainly not new these days or a surprise, but they stand out in a couple of kind of interesting ways. Among Republicans, 41% said Trump did best, only 9% thought Biden did best. And if you flip that among Democrats, 76% said Biden best, only 1% of Democrats thought Trump did best. And independents, it's 24 Biden, 15 Trump. But there is a difference in the percent by party that say both did badly. Among Republicans, fully 21% say both had a bad night, and it's 23% among independents. But it drops off sharply to just 6% among Democrats. And Republicans, a full quarter of Republicans say they didn't pay that much attention to the debate. But only 15% of Democrats say they didn't pay much attention to the debate. So I think there's maybe a little bit of partisan lens in seeing both doing poorly or in saying, I didn't pay much attention to it, where Democrats are more willing to have an opinion and say they paid attention, Republicans discounting the debate a bit.
So this is also our first poll since the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and since the nomination by President Trump of Judge Amy Coney Barrett. A lot of talk about whether this nomination should proceed. Should senators vote on the nomination before the election? Should they wait until after the election to decide if they should vote on it? We asked the voters of Wisconsin.
And once again, an issue that seemed like it might dominate the news this past week, but which seems almost a distant memory at the moment. Now, the Senate is moving forward with hearings and may vote, so this is coming back into the news, but at the moment it's been a bit drowned out. But we did ask, should the Senate go ahead and vote before the election in November? 44% said they should, but 51% said the Senate should wait until after the election and only then decide whether to vote on the nomination or not. And again, sharp partisan divisions, no surprise there. 81% of Republicans say vote before the election, 90% of Democrats say afterwards, and independents are evenly split, 39 before, 41 after.
We've been asking a fair number of questions related to the pandemic since we first began to be aware of the extent of it back, I think, in late March. I want to ask you about what we found this time, Charles. How concerned, how worried are people about getting this virus?
Well, there's an increase in worry this month, which may be driven in part by the large increase that we're seeing breaking out around the state, and especially in the Green Bay area and the broader Green Bay region, the Fox Valley region. 27% this month say they're very worried about becoming ill from the coronavirus. That was 21% in September, so a 6-point increase. At the other end of the scale, 21% say they're not at all worried about it. That's not much different from the 19% in September. What we have seen is people shuffle in and out of being very concerned versus somewhat concerned, and being not very concerned versus not at all concerned. So if you combine those categories, it's been fairly stable, but you can clearly see movement of very concerned, very worried, getting higher or lower, and it seems to track with the prevalence of cases in the state. In June, when we were a bit of a low point, 19% were very concerned. In August, when we were seeing a rise in cases, 27% were very concerned. But then in early September, when cases dropped off again, 21%, and now with a new flurry of cases, back up to 27%. So it's not off the scales by any means, but it does show this fluctuation that seems to line up with the prevalence of cases in the state.
As you say, Wisconsin has become a hot spot in recent weeks, and I'm wondering if that has anything to do with how people perceive the long-term picture here. How soon life will be back to normal in Wisconsin? How soon the coronavirus will be under control? What did we see in terms of people's thoughts about the future?
Well, people think it'll be with us for a while. Fully half say that it will continue for at least another year or more. 28% about a year, and 22% say more than a year from now. Only about 20% think it will be under control within the next 2 or 3 months, or it's under 5%, say now. Um, we've seen this perspective play out over the course of the spring and summer. We've had to change the wording of the question as we've moved further and further into the epidemic. But that long-term view that a year or more from now is now the view of about half the public, I think, is the critical part. And the 20% of optimists who think will be under control within 3 months.
Well, college football is coming back. Some conferences around the country are already playing. Their seasons are underway. But the Big Ten, after first saying it wasn't going to play, decided it was going to play. The Badgers will start their season later this month. How do people feel about that prospect? Do they think that Big Ten and Wisconsin should be playing football right now?
Well, 47% say they should play football. 40% say not. This is an interesting contrast. Earlier, we saw that more people thought in-person rallies should not be held. And in earlier months, we've asked about, would you be comfortable going to a big athletic event? And most people are not comfortable with that. On the other hand, perhaps people are seeing empty football stadiums for professional football and thinking this is not, in fact, the mass audience sport, and they're thinking about the game itself. And they have the model of professional football, which has been played and has had some small outbreaks on a few teams, but has continued to play.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was watching actually a game involving the University of Georgia over the weekend. I was kind of surprised how many people were in the stands. So it depends a little bit on the conference what they're doing in terms of people being allowed to attend games. It's
They're very big
selective.
difference. Very big differences state to state and conference to conference on this, and as well as what people see with NBA games or professional football games.
Let's talk for a moment, Charles, about masks and whether or not the people of Wisconsin feel that masks should be worn in all public places.
Well, this comes on the heel of Governor Evers reinstating and extending a mask requirement. 72% agree that masks should be required in all public places. 26% disagree with that. That's up just a shade from 69% in early August, right after the first mask order was issued. And at that point, 29% were opposed. So not much change, but something close to 3 out of 4 voters think that they should be required in public places.
Is that the case statewide, Charles, or are certain regions of the state much more receptive to the idea of wearing masks all the time?
There is some regional variation, but solid majorities in every region support the mask requirement. And that's as true this month as it was back in early August when it first started. It's over 80% in the city of Milwaukee. This time it's 67% in the Milwaukee suburbs, 79% in Madison. In Green Bay, it's 74% support masks. And the one region we've seen a bit of change is the rest of the state. That's the northern and western part of the state, including Wausau and La Crosse Eau Claire and the northwest up to Lake Superior. There, this month, 66% agree with requiring masks, 60% supported it in August. So a little bit of an increase in that more rural northern and western part of the state.
And we do see sharp partisan differences here.
We sure do. There's I think a widespread perception that the wearing of masks varies a lot by region, and that may well be true. Unfortunately, the pollster forgot to ask whether you wear a mask and instead ask whether you thought they should be required. So I'm sorry to say I don't have a direct answer about people's reports of their own behavior. But what we do see is that while professed agreement with requiring a mask is very widespread across the regions, it does vary with party. And there, Republicans are pretty evenly divided on this issue. 47% agree with, 49% disagree. That's down just a little bit in disagreement from August. It was 43 agreed, 54 opposed masks in August among Republicans, so a little tighter there. But among independents, it's at least 2-1 in favor of masks, and among Democrats, unanimity in this latest poll, 98% favored the masks, 1% opposed. So a very partisan split. But still, among Republicans, it's far from unified. It's, in fact, an even split within the GOP.
Let's talk for a moment, Charles, about another major story that has dominated the headlines throughout the summer and into this fall, and that is the protests that we've seen against the killings of Black Americans by police. We've been looking at this for a while, starting soon after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. What are we seeing in terms of public attitudes towards these protests that we've seen?
After an initial surge of support for the protests in June, we saw a pretty substantial drop-off in support by early August, before the events in Kenosha. But we've seen very little change since then. In June, 61% approved of the protests. That fell to 48% in early August and 47% in early September. And now in early October, it's 46% approve, 49% disapprove. It was 47-48 last month. So very little movement after the midsummer. I think we saw a surge of sympathy at the beginning. We then saw a drawback in support, but it's remained very flat since then, even comparing before Kenosha with after Kenosha, we've seen virtually no change.
How about whether people have a favorable or unfavorable opinion about the Black Lives Matter movement?
As with the protests, there was a lot of sympathy in June when 59% were favorable, 27% unfavorable. That fell off in early August, 49% favorable, didn't budge at all in early September, and dropped just a shade to 46% favorable, 40% unfavorable this month. It was 49-37 last month, so about a 3-point move in each direction.
Something that we asked about for the first time, Charles, and that is how Governor Evers had handled the events that followed the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, and then, of course, the unrest that followed that. How do people think Governor Evers handled the response to what happened in Kenosha?
This is the weakest area of job performance for Governor Evers that we've measured. 40% approve of the way he handled the events in Kenosha, 44% disapprove. So he's a net negative on this, whereas he's been net positive on overall job approval and net positive on his handling of coronavirus pretty much throughout his term as governor, and certainly throughout 2020 that's been the case. So this is a case where a substantial percentage disapprove of the job he's doing, 4 points more than those who approve.
How do Wisconsin voters think the president has handled the protests that followed George Floyd's killing?
Yes, and this is more of a contrast. For the president, 37% approve of his response to the protests, but 54% disapprove. As with so many other things, this is fairly stable. Last month it was 36-54. It is slightly up in approval. Back in June, it was 30-58. So a little bit more approval than we had in June, but not much change at all over the last month.
Let's look at some favorability ratings for the president and for Joe Biden. How did the president fare when we asked whether people had a favorable or unfavorable opinion of him?
Yeah, he's a net negative on this, as he has been for a while. 42% favorable, 53% unfavorable, and 4% who don't give him a favorability rating. It's a noticeable change. If we look at January through May, he was net negative, but it was in single digits, -5, -7. In fact, it was -5 3 times in there and -7 in May. Ticked down to -12, more unfavorable than favorable. And since then, it's been -13, -12, and -11 in this latest survey. So again, pretty stable. And in fact, for the last 4 surveys, it's been 42% favorable in all of them. These small variations come in the percent unfavorable.
And contrast that to Joe Biden, because we have seen a little movement in Biden's numbers over that time.
We have, and the starkest contrast is from February when he was still in the Democratic primary battle. And in fact, the timing of our February survey was at the low point of his standing in national polls for the primary. So at that point, he was a net -19, 34 favorable, 53 unfavorable. That got a little bit better to -11 in March, just before our primary. But then once he clinched the nomination, it's gotten considerably better. Negative scores, but in the low single digits, until last month he had closed it to a -2, 45-47. And now this month, for the first time, a net positive, +3, 48-45. So that's a 5-point net shift for him, comparing prior to the debate last September, early September, and now post-debate. I can't attribute all of that change just to the debate, because it's everything that's happened between our September poll and now that contribute to this. But it is the first time that we've seen Biden with a net favorable.
We also have favorability ratings for Vice President Pence and Senator Harris.
And here they're much more balanced. Vice President Pence is a net -1, 41 favorable, 42 unfavorable, 17 that don't have an opinion of him. And for Kamala Harris, it's a net -3, 37 favorable, 40 unfavorable, but 23% don't have an opinion of her. I said earlier that despite being in the vice presidency for 3.5 years, 17% don't have an opinion about the vice president. And for Senator Harris, it's a bit higher than that.
Favorability ratings often are pretty similar to job approval ratings. So let's ask how the president did in his job approval rating.
They do tend to be similar, and it is interesting that we get the same kind of stability. 44% approve of the job the president's doing overall, 52% disapprove. It's been 44% approved for the last 3 months. Last month, it was 54 disapprove versus 52 disapprove this time. So a slight improvement in his net overall job approval, but underwater as he has been consistent. His score was 48-48, which happened over the winter.
As we move towards the home stretch of this campaign, there is one particular area for the president that has continued to be a source of strength, and that is his handling of the economy. Was that the case, in fact, again this time around?
It is. The story of stability gets awfully old as we have to keep repeating it, but it is what we're seeing. 51% approve of his handling of the economy, 45% disapprove. It was 52-44 last month, and it's been at least 50% in each month since May.
And how about his handling of the coronavirus, which is, he's been well underwater in our polling on this, Charles, and I'm wondering if there's been any change, or is that too stable like the others?
Also stable, no change since last month, but it has changed over the course of the epidemic. In March, late March, shortly after the president had declared a national emergency and formed the coronavirus task force, his best score on this, 51% approved, 46% disapproved, not too far off from his economic job rating. But that fell ever since. 44% approved in May and June, 40% in early September. I'm sorry, my mistake, in early August, 40% approved. And it's been 41-56 for both of the last 2 months. So a bit of a greater negative rating in the last 3 months than there was in May and June, and a good deal lower than there was at the beginning of the epidemic.
And how do people in this state feel about the way Governor Evers has handled the response to the coronavirus?
He's a bit of a similar trajectory to President Trump, but one at much higher levels of approval. When the epidemic first broke out, 76% approved of the job he was doing. That fell to 64% and then 58%. It has stabilized recently. Last month it was 57-38 approved. This month 56-38. So still a substantial net approval, but one that is no longer in the stratospheric level that it was in the early spring. As I say, also President Trump has fallen off, but at lower levels of approval.
Charles, there's a lot of talk about how people are going to vote this year. Some people, as we found out in our polling, have already voted. And so you have choices. You can vote by mail. You can do in-person early voting. You can vote in person on the day of the election. What are people doing in terms of this election cycle?
Yeah, well, there's, of course, a big increase in absentee by mail compared to previous years. But what we've actually seen is some decline in the percentage that say they plan to do that. We've fallen off now to 32% in the latest poll who say they'll vote absentee by mail, 10% vote early in person, and 54% on election day in person. That is a pretty good shift from May, when it was 43 by mail and 39 in person on election day, and about the same 11 early in person. So there has been some shift in this over time, but it's still a substantial absentee by mail.
Yeah, the president's been very critical of voting by mail, and has said that he believes it will lead to fraud. I don't know if you could say this with certainty, but we do see it in the results that Republicans are much more likely to vote in person at the polls on election day.
As we've seen since the spring, Republicans are much less likely to say they'll vote absentee by mail. 18% of Republicans say that. 47% of Democrats say it in this latest poll. So there's quite a partisan imbalance. 69% of Republicans on election day in person. 39% of Democrats say that. Independents are sort of in between those two. And so there has been a shift, but there's still a predominance of Democrats using absentee, though that Democratic percentage has been falling over time.
We see Biden with a big advantage, I assume, in the early voting, and then Trump, at least in our polling, would suggest that he have a big advantage on election day.
That's right. And so we do think that the election day in-person vote, if people do what they're saying today, would look at about 33% Biden, 54% for Trump, while the absentee by mail would be about 67% for Biden, 20% for Trump, and the rest is don't know, undecided, third party. So there is a stark difference between those. But as Democrats have become a bit less likely to say they'll vote by mail, we've seen some equalization of this so that the election day electorate doesn't look quite as heavy in Republicans and in Trump supporters. The absentee vote, even though it remains very heavily pro-Biden, is not as strongly pro-Biden as it was, as we've gotten a little more of an equal mix of partisanship by type of ballot.
For this poll, we brought back an old favorite of ours, a question that I think we first asked in 2012 at the height of the contentious recall election for governor. And this is a question about whether people have stopped talking with other people because of their political differences. And so tell us what we found this year in this time where all we hear about is our toxic politics.
Right. Well, the evidence for that toxic politics remains. 36% say they've stopped talking to someone because of differences over the presidential election. 63% say they've not done that. They've continued to talk. That's up only a small shade from October of 2016, when 34% said they'd stopped talking and 65% said they had not. You mentioned the first time we asked this was in the recall election, and at that time I thought it was phenomenally high at 32 or 33%. It's in the same ballpark, but if anything, it's slightly higher than it was even during the recall.
Yeah, little did we know that we were seeing the future there back in 2012. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. This is something we ask in just about every poll, and that's whether or not you think the economy has gotten better or worse than this past year, and whether you think it'll get better or worse in the next year.
Yeah, this is something that obviously changed tremendously as we went into the recession following the COVID epidemic. We asked the question, has the economy gotten better or gotten worse or stayed the same over the last 12 months? And the net for that is now negative 28. 25% say it's gotten better, 53% gotten worse. It was plus 31 back in January for a comparison between those. Really a phenomenal change, but of course, real world events have really changed. This is interesting because views of the economy have responded to real world events, even though the stability of evaluation of President Trump's handling of the economy has been remarkably steady over that same period of time, and really raises the contrast between evaluating the outside world of the economy versus applying that to evaluations of the president. One of the potential strengths for President Trump, the incumbent, though, is that as negative as these views are of the last year, people remain quite optimistic about the future. A net plus 25 say the economy will be better a year from now rather than worse. 43% think it'll get better, 18% think it will get worse. That's the sort of future optimism that we've retained throughout the current recession. And actually, it's more positive about the future than what we were seeing in January, where more people said it would stay the same. And so the net was not as high.
How did people in the state describe their current family financial situation?
Here we've seen a lot of stability despite the economic impacts of the recession. 60% say they're living comfortably, 30% just getting by, and 9% struggling. But those numbers are very close to where they were back in January and February when they were 62, 29, and 8. So only the smallest hint of change on people's personal financial situation.
And we'll wrap things up here, Charles, with a couple of favorability rankings for familiar, or we should say presumably familiar, people in Wisconsin, public officials, Tony Evers, Senator Baldwin, and Senator Johnson.
Tony Evers maintains a net favorable rating, 47 to 40, in somewhat in line with his overall job approval rating that's remained net positive for a while. Senator Baldwin is at 41 favorable, 35 unfavorable, a positive 6. But despite being in her second term in the Senate, 23% lack an opinion of her. Senator Ron Johnson, who's been in the Senate even longer, has a 35 favorable, 31 unfavorable view. That's a plus 4. And that reverses a negative 4, 32, 36 last month. But again, a lot of people don't know him even more than Baldwin. 34%, 1 in 3, lack an opinion of the senior senator from the state.
One of the great mysteries of the Marquette Law School Poll. We always sit there and shake our heads and try to figure that out. Let's wrap things up with maybe a final thought. And I guess what I would look at, Charles, is the stability that you keep talking about. A lot has happened in the news since we were last in the field, but it really hasn't moved things much.
No, it is the phenomenal story of this administration that events that we think are massive and should have gigantic impacts don't. And I think you couldn't find a better example than what we saw on the economy, that people see a much worse economy now, but it doesn't affect the president's job approval numbers. Now, I do think you can tell a story there that this recession was certainly induced by the coronavirus epidemic. So there's an easy story about why that's not the president's responsibility. But it mirrors a pattern we've seen in national polling that in this administration, but also in much of the Obama administration, changes in the state of the economy or other world events seem to move job approval of the president only by small amounts. And in real contrast to during the George administration and in all other administrations from Clinton going backwards, where improving economies raised approval not just in the president's party, but among the opposition party. And when things went bad, whether through wars or through an economic downturn, people fell both with the president's party and with the opposition party. But what we've seen since the second year of the Obama administration and throughout the Trump administration is that partisans of the opposite party give the president a job approval rating below 10% and don't respond to improving economic circumstances and don't seem to respond to other events. Of course, they're so low they can't go much worse. But likewise, the president's party doesn't respond very much. When bad things happened in the Obama administration or bad things happened in the Trump administration, their partisans did not lower their approval at all of the president. And so that creates this phenomenal stability that we see, but it also raises the question about how do we maintain control over presidents in terms of rewarding them for good things and punishing them for bad things, if in fact we simply won't change our views of them no matter what happens. And that's something that, we're now in our 12th year of seeing with presidents, and it is a stunning contrast to the pattern we saw in George W. Bush's administration and before.
Charles, if people want the full results of the survey, want to look at the crosstabs, where do they go?
Go to law.marquette.edu/poll, P-O-L-L, and look at the top of the page for the results and data tab. Click on that and you'll get all the nitty-gritty details, methodology, questionnaire, results of all the questions, and so on. And let me leave you with my last point. Remember, the poll does not have a vote. This is in the hands of the voters and the citizens, and that's where it belongs in a democratic republic. Go vote.
Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Poll. It's always a pleasure having you break down the results for us. Thanks very much, and thanks to everyone who's been out there today watching. We'll see you next time on The Issues.